Welcome, everyone. This is the book of Deuteronomy, Telling and Retelling with Rabbi David Silber, and this is our second session as part of Fallsman at Drisha. It's a great pleasure to be learning with Rabbi Silber today as he delves into Deuteronomy, a new version of an old story. For sources for today, please keep your preferred Tanakh or Chumash at hand. However, we will share sources on screen from Sfaria when Rabbi Silber is quoting from them. And with that, I'm going to pass the podium over, so to speak, to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Okay, we have started the book of Devarim, fifth book of the Torah, also known as Mishnah Torah. Just to repeat what I mentioned last week by way of introduction, the approach that we'll be taking to the study of Sefer Devarim is that Sefer Devarim is going to be read on its own. In other words, when one reads the book of Devarim, one encounters the first question I think one raises is, what is the relationship between the book of Devarim and the books of the Torah that precede it? Because among other things, there seem to be contradictions between what it says in Sefer Devarim and what it said earlier. There's a lot of new material. How does one relate to Sefer Devarim in the context of the Torah in general? And the approach that I'll be taking, for those who have studied with me together over time, not surprising, is that we're looking at what it says in Sefer Devarim in and of itself. Whether to reconcile or not is a different question. But the book of Devarim presents us with one might say, a different way to look at the past and a different understanding, perhaps, of what the future holds for us. We will deal, of course, with the parallel stories in Sefer Devarim and that precede Sefer Devarim, but we're going to, in terms of Pshuto Shel Mikra, look what it actually seems to say in this book. Now, as I mentioned last week, the book of Devarim can be divided into different sections. The first 4 chapters are, one might say, kind of history of what transpired in the past. When I say a history, I want to qualify that. It's not actually a history, because the fact of the matter is that in the first 4 chapters, Moshe, who's the speaker of Sefer Devarim, is presented as the words of Moshe. Moshe singles out certain events and passes over many other events. For example, one thing that's not mentioned in the first 4 chapters is the story of the golden calf. Now, the story of the golden calf, one could argue, is probably the most important story that appears beginning with the second book of the Torah. It's a story that really redefines Israel's relationship to God. That story does not appear in the first 4 chapters. However, it appears at great length in the next section. So it's very striking. It's very strange. It's not found in the first 4 chapters at all. Moshe doesn't mention it. When we come to part 2, and what is part 2? Part 2 begins in chapter 5 and runs through chapter 26. Part 2 itself has 2 parts. One is chapter 5 through chapter 10 inclusive, or maybe chapter 11 even. And then there's chapters 12 through 26. 12 through 26 are a list of many, many, many mitzvot. But chapters 5 through 11, which we will study, comprise a unit. And there's not a lot of mitzvot mentioned there. But in that context, it mentions the receiving of the Torah at Sinai. It mentions Shema. It ends with the second paragraph of the Shema. Some of the most basic ideas that lie perhaps behind the mitzvot. The core one seems to be the mitzvah to love God. Avat Hashem is a basic theme in the book of Devarim. Does not appear earlier, but appears as a central mitzvah in the second part. I would say part 2a. So in that context of chapters 5 through 11 inclusive, there we have a lengthy discussion, a lengthy description of receiving of the Torah, and in particular, the story of the golden calf. So one thing to think about as we go through Sefer Devarim is, why does Moshe mention the golden calf only in the second section and not mention it all in the first section? It's not about history. Because history would have to involve many, many other events that happened as the Torah records them, that are pretty central, such as crossing the sea, leaving Egypt, crossing the sea, the golden calf, the Korach rebellion. None of that is mentioned in these chapters. So we have to understand why Moshe mentions what he does mention. Just want to make that point as we begin our study. Now, what we began last week with the very beginning of the book, and here, after an introduction, in the first chapter, Moshe says in the sixth verse, Hashem Elokeinu diber Eleinu, chapter 1, verse 6, Hashem Elokeinu diber Eleinu b'charev leimar, Rav lachem shevet bahar hazeh. God spoke to us at Chorev. Chorev is Sinai. And God said, enough, you've stayed at this mountain long enough, and now travel. Pnu usu lachem. So the book begins with the instructions to travel, to leave Sinai, and to move towards the land which they've been promised. And that's in verse number 8, explicit. Rei natati lifnechem et haaretz. Behold, I've given you this land, the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Bo reshua haaretz, shenishba Hashem lavotechem, liAvraham, liYitzchak, liYaakov, latet lahem, u'azaram achreihem. So this is the command. That's how the book begins. You were told, possess the land. And Torah said earlier in chapter 1 that the amount of time it takes to travel from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, which is the place from which they will launch, presumably, the attempt to possess the land, is 11 days. It's an 11-day journey. They're on the cusp of possessing the land or entering into battles which will ultimately result in their possessing the land. And now we have in verse number 9, Moshe says to them about himself, says Moshe, I can't do this by myself. I can't do this by myself. And Moshe, God has multiplied you, made you so many. That's verse number 10. There are too many of you. I can't do it by myself. There's so many of you. I need help. And therefore, and God should bless you even more, says Moshe. And therefore, in verse number 12, he once again says he can't do it himself. This for a different reason. How can I, that it's not just the too many of you, but you have many needs. There's the burden of carrying you. There's the acting as a mediator or a judge in disputes. There's the teaching of the Torah, the showing you the path. That can't be done by me. I can't do that. And therefore, says Moshe, you should choose. Havulachem anoshim chachamim yiduim nivonim viduim vasimein berashechem. Says Moshe, choose for yourself. You choose people who are wise, people that are wise, knowledgeable, chachamim, nivonim, people that you know have some experience with you, and I will place them over you as judges. And you said to me, and you responded, you said in verse number 14, Tov hadavar asher dibarta lasot, good idea, very good. And Moshe says, I did exactly that in verse number 15. That's how the book begins. Now, let's just stop for a moment to think about this. The question that I raised the last week as we began our study is that this description of what happened in the past does not seem to accord either to what we have in the book of Shemot in chapter 18, where Moshe is sitting by himself and his father-in-law, who's come to visit him, says, you can't do this by yourself. It's too difficult for you. You need help. Moshe responded, why are you sitting by yourself? And Moshe said, well, people come to seek God. By that, Moshe means I'm the only one who has access to God. Justice and judgment should come from God alone. And Yitro said to Moshe something along the lines of, it's a very good idea in principle, but it doesn't work. And therefore, you need to do something else. And Yitro's advice was to have the people judge. They will act as judges. And when the matter is too difficult, they'll come to you. That was Yitro's idea. Over here in Sefer Devarim, it sounds like it's Moshe's idea. He doesn't mention Yitro. Secondly, and this is an interesting difference between Sefer Devarim and what we encountered in the story of Yitro in Exodus and Shemot chapter 18, is that the qualifications of a judge in chapter 18 of Exodus seem to be very different from what we have over here in Devarim. In Yitro, when Yitro speaks to Moshe, he instructs Moshe to choose Anshe Chayil, people of perhaps courageous people, Anshe Emet, truthful people, Yirei Elohim, God-fearing people, Sonei Betza, those who hate corruption. The qualities of the judge, from Yitro's perspective, is basically, in a word, integrity. People of integrity, God-fearing people, honest people, etc. When Moshe speaks over here to the people and instructs them to choose judges, you should choose the judges, he says, but the qualifications he mentions, apart from they're known to you, chachamim unevonim, wise people. In other words, we encounter something in Devarim we didn't encounter earlier, that judges have to be knowledgeable, wise, etc. And that's actually very interesting because it seems to be a theme of Sefer Devarim in general. The idea of wisdom, and the idea that the Torah actually is itself wise, and those who study it can gain wisdom, is something that appears later in Sefer Devarim. When Moshe speaks about to the people, Moshe says later on, I believe it's chapter 4, you have, what other nation has such just wise laws, wise chukim and mishpatim? And Moshe adds, Chochmatchem ubinatchem li'enei ha'amim. Chochma and bina, the two words. Your Torah is a wise Torah, and the world will recognize the wisdom of the Torah. So Sefer Devarim, we'll come back to this, puts an emphasis not just on Torah as central. The centrality of Torah is one of the basic themes of Sefer Devarim. But apart from that, the Torah is itself wise. In fact, very famously, the Rambam cited that verse in Sefer Devarim about the Torah being wise. The nations will see the wisdom of the Torah. And the Rambam cited that verse in conjunction with a different famous question that's dealt with by the commentaries on the Torah and others, namely, what's called Tamei HaMitzvot. Are there reasons for the mitzvot? Are the mitzvot, and Sefer Devarim has a lot of mitzvot, do they all have to make sense? Or one could say, they don't have to make sense. God commands you to do it, you do it. Maybe there's no reason to it. Maybe it's arbitrary. God decided to do X. Maybe it makes no sense. But we do it because God commanded it. And furthermore, don't even try to understand why God commanded it. God's command is sufficient. There is a Rashi in one place who seems to suggest something along those lines. Others disagree with Rashi. The Ramban disagrees with Rashi. And the Rambam, famously in his guide, disagrees with Rashi, or with that position. The Rambam says anybody who thinks that the Torah, the laws of the Torah, don't have to make sense, the Rambam calls that person sick. That person's a sick person, sickness, he says. How can one imagine that God's teachings don't make sense? If someone said to you, please do X, and you said, why? No reason. I just want, what? You would think that person is a fool. You certainly wouldn't want to obey such a command. Explain to me why. So the Rambam says that makes no sense. It's a sickness. And he quotes that verse from Devarim that we'll encounter later on. The nations of the world will see the wisdom, says the Rambam. If there's no reason for it, why would they see the wisdom? How could they see the wisdom? Therefore, it has to make sense. And my point is that this idea of wisdom, knowledge and wisdom, we encounter in the very beginning of this book, because the judges have to be chachamim and nevonim, and that the Torah never said that earlier. The Torah mentioned judges in two places, or judges or quasi-judges in two places. One is, as we saw last week, chapter 18 of Shemot, And the second place was chapter 11 of Sefer Bamidbar. There, Moshe complains to God that he can't do it, actually. There, Moshe complains to God, not to the people, but complain to God in chapter 11 is too difficult for me. I can't carry the people. He puts it in terms of carrying the people. What am I, a nursemaid who can carry the baby? I can't do it, he says. And God says to Moshe, okay, I'm going to get you help. Gather 70 elders of the people that you know are the leaders of the people. That's what you have over here. Yiduim. Take them to the center of the camp, and I will place your spirit upon them. So what qualifications do they have? Answer, none really, except they have experience with the people, which is important. And that's why in that context, I will place your spirit upon them. They have no spirit of their own. And that perhaps you're going to do things counter to what you want. So therefore, I'm going to place your spirit upon them. That's chapter 11. So in neither place, not in Bamidbar chapter 11, nor in Shemot chapter 18, does it talk about wisdom. Doesn't mention wisdom. Wisdom is a Sefer Devarim theme, and it's tied in with something else in Sefer Devarim that we will see at the center of this book, the centrality of Torah. The centrality of Torah is a basic theme of Sefer Devarim, more than any other place. We will encounter that. In any event, that's how the book begins. So the first thing we encounter in the book is the appointing of judges. It's actually very striking. Now, the appointing of judges actually appears later in the Sefer Devarim as well. And it appears, I just mentioned where it appears, it's in Parshat Shoftim. In Parshat Shoftim, there it talks about appointing judges. And I just read the first couple of verses, which is actually chapter 16, verse number 18. Shoftim v'shotrim titein l'cha b'chol sha'arecha. Asher Hashem Elokecha notenecha l'shvatecha v'shaftu et ha'am mishpat tzedek. There is a commandment to appoint judges. Shoftim v'shotrim. Shoftim is shofet is a judge. A shoter is one who carries out the law, some kind of official, maybe a kind of who can enforce the law. If you have laws on the books that are never enforced, they're not really laws. So you need the laws have to be enforced. That's shoftim v'shotrim, and that's the command. And the Torah says v'shaftu et mishpat tzedek, and there it goes into a few verses. What does it mean to judge people with justice? Not to favor anybody, not to take bribes. Verse number 20, tzedek, tzedek tirdof. So there's a command when you come into the land, a specific command to appoint judges in all of your different places, right? B'chol sha'arecha, in all of your gates, etc. Now that command to appoint judges, which appears in chapter 16, that of course is the first commandment of this book. And not only is the first commandment of the book, but let's start now. Let's pick up where we got to last time, and let's start with chapter 1, verse number 16. Moshe's sort of telling the story, okay? He begins with judges. I commanded your judges at that time. Shomoa bein achechem ushvatetem tzedek, bein ish uvein achiv uvein gero. First thing the book says, I commanded you, the judges at that time, to judge fairly with justice between one person and achiv. It doesn't mean brother over here. It doesn't mean just your brother. It would mean perhaps your fellow Jew, as opposed to ubein gero, stranger. In other words, when it comes to justice, the Torah says, judge everybody the same, fairly, whether it's your fellow Jew, whether it's a resident in the land who's not Jewish, perhaps, ben gero. It's never clear what ger means. Does it mean one who accepts Judaism, or does it mean one who dwells in the land? But it's in contradistinction to achiv, your brother, or someone who's not your brother, but resides amongst you. And then Moshe continues, and I told the judges, lo takiru panim b'mishpat, favor nobody. No favoritism when it comes to judging. Kakoton kagodol tishma'un. Here, the big and the small. Listen to both sides. One could be an important person, one seemingly less important. That doesn't matter. Everybody gets the same hearing in court. Hearing, tishma'un. Lo taguru mipnei ish. Have no fear. Judge without fear. Ki hamishpat le'Elohim, for justice belongs to God. Which means you're obligated to do what God wants you to do. Your own personal inclinations or fears should not come into play. If the matter is too difficult, takrivun elai ushmativ, bring the matter to me. So when you read this, it of course recalls the story of Yitro once again. That's what Yitro says to Moshe. The people have to judge. When the matter is too difficult for them, let them bring the matter to you. When we studied the book of Shemot, and I maybe mentioned it last week as well, I made the point that Moshe, what was Moshe thinking? He has 1 million, 2 million people standing in front of him, one judge. Yitro says, this is crazy. It doesn't. You'll wear yourself out. They can't get justice. They can't get a day in court. What was Moshe thinking? Well, Moshe was thinking very simply, judgment belongs to God. We have no right to judge anybody. And I'm the only person who has access to God. To which Yitro says to Moshe, that's true. Theoretically, you're right, but it can't work that way. So therefore, let them deal with the matters that they can deal with, do the best they can. When it's too difficult for them, they have to understand they have to go to you and ask you, and you can bring the matter to God. That's what Yitro says. We have it over here in chapter 1 of Devarim, minus Yitro. It sounds when you read this was Moshe's initiative. The impetus is Moshe's. He realizes it's too difficult. He can't do it himself. Maybe we'll come back to what that says to us. But in any event, this is how the book begins. Now we can ask the question, what do we make of the fact that this is how the book begins? And I have a suggestion. I have a suggestion, and I'm stop and take any comments or questions. And my suggestion is very simply this. You have it later on. Shoftim v'shotrim titein l'cha, but the obligation to appoint judges when you come into the land. The point I think over here is that when you come into the land, okay, you're going to engage in wars, you're going to try to capture the land. But the point is of having a system of judges and justice. This is a prerequisite to staying in the land. You're going into the land to set up a just society. The first thing you have to know, the goal of coming into the land is to create a just people, a just society. The first thing. And actually it's very interesting that the book of Devarim, Sefer Devarim, the Jewish tradition is that we always read, this is ever since we finished the Torah in 1 year, we always read Parshat Devarim the week before Tisha B'Av. Always read the week before Tisha B'Av, and we always conclude Sefer Devarim on Simchat Torah. We move from the day of mourning, the deepest day of mourning, to the most joyous day of the year over the course of this book. When it comes to Tisha B'Av, there is, of course, the Torah reading of Devarim, and there's also the Haftorah, what's called Shabbat Chazon. The Haftorah for Tisha B'Av is the first chapter of Yeshayahu, Chazon Yeshayahu ben Amos. The last verse talks about, the prophet says, condemns the people for their behavior, warns them of dire consequences, and the Haftorah ends with, how can things be made right? And things are made right in the Haftorah when the system of justice is put in place. In fact, the last verse of the Haftorah is, Sion v'mishpati podeh v'shavel b'tzedakah. Sion will be redeemed through justice. And in that very Haftorah, v'yashiva shoftayach k'varishona v'yoatzayach k'vatchila. Acharei chen yikarei loch ir hatzedek kiryat nemanah. Jerusalem should be the city of tzedek. And tzedek requires justice. And that the promise is, I will someday restore your judges as they were once in the past. They were virtuous in the past. And Sion shall be redeemed with righteousness. In other words, The Haftorah for Tisha B'Av, actually, Chazon, is actually related to the Parsha. It's very interesting. It's not just related to Tisha B'Av. That's how the Parsha starts. You're about to possess the land. The first thing you have to know before anything else is you need to have judges and justice. You can have judges without justice, by the way, of course, but that's what Moshe says. I told the judges how to behave. Give everybody a fair trial. Don't favor one or the other. The Talmud understands kakaton, kagadol, tishmun means they both have to be in the court at the same time. Don't listen to one side without the other side being present. That's not inappropriate. They both have to be there at the same time. But the idea of beginning with mishpat is central to possessing the land. Now, there's something else I want to say about that, but before I do that, let me stop here for a moment and take any comments or questions. If anybody has any comments or questions, please speak up.
So far, no comments or questions in chat, but people are invited to ask there if they can't unmute themselves at this time.
Okay, if not, we'll just continue. No problem. Okay, so that's the first thing. Okay.
It
Yes.
sounds like there's a real pessimism on the part of Moshe in Devarim about the people, that on some level, even after 40 years, the trauma of Egypt is still entrenched, and he's terribly worried. It's not just his leaving, but in general, whether to trust people without the outside structure of law and occasional wise people.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that comes through very, very clearly. Actually, later on in the book, it's pretty explicit, by the way, that what you said is, I think, a pretty basic theme of Sefer Devarim. Remember that this is the book of Devarim says that Moshe is talking to the people in the 40th year, in the 11th month. They're going to be 40 years in the desert. Moshe is not going to be around too much longer, and Moshe is extremely concerned that after he's gone, the people will stray. In fact, towards the end of the book, there's a rather harsh, I would say, statement, a set of very harsh statements, which seem to say that exile will be inevitable. In fact, that not only at the end of the book, which talks about God hiding God's face, the song of Hazinu, but even prior to that, even in the earlier chapters, there's and this is the reading for Tisha B'Av, which is chapter 4. It's Shantem Aretz. The idea of when you are in a place for a long time, Moshe's concern is actually, one might say in one word, complacency. You're going to be there, and people assume because it was this way in the past, it's always going to be the same, which is a very dangerous way to think, because things can change, and they can change sometimes very quickly, and we have to be on the alert. And Moshe is trying to instruct us how to behave in such a way that can ensure that we will be in the land for a very long time. But he is certainly, I want to say pessimistic, I would say, maybe that's not a bad word here. He's certainly wary of the fact and concerned that the people will eventually stray, and that that will result in people being exiled from the land. In fact, the second parsha of the Shema, which is found in a very interesting place in Sefer Devarim, chapter 11, it's what it says. If you keep the mitzvot, Shema, if you obey God's word, there'll be a blessing. But if not, Vavatem Mehera, there'll be exile. So that what Chaim is suggesting is a good insight in chapter 1, but it's even more explicit later on in many places in this book. This is a warning. And in fact, by the way, I would add one more thing to what Chaim was suggesting, is that the tradition, we know that in the book of Malachim, in the time of Yoshiyahu, King Yoshiyahu, they find the Sefer Torah inside the temple. And they bring it to Yoshiyahu. When he reads this thing, he's shocked out of his mind. It talks about exile. The tradition is that, the widely held tradition, is that the book that they're finding is Sefer Devarim, and he reads it. Sefer Devarim is pretty explicit. Misbehave, you're going to be exiled, and he understands that the end is near. So he tries his best to have this great religious reformation, and to some extent he succeeds. But at the end of the day, for whatever reason, the exile comes. So this is a fundamental theme of almost all of Sefer Devarim. Of course, the very end of Sefer Devarim, we have a bunch of blessings. We don't want to end on this negative note, but we have to be aware of this from the very beginning. This is Moshe's concern. That's a very important point. We'll come back to that point multiple times over the course of our study. Okay, now we have something very curious. And let's pick up with verse number 19. V'nisame chorev, v'neiler et kol hamidbar hagadol v'hanorahu asher ritem derech hara emori kasher tiva Hashem Elokeinu otanu v'navo ad Kodesh Barnea. So we're traveling along, and we come to Kodesh Barnea. And now in verse number 20, v'omar lechem v'atem ad hara emori asher Hashem Elokeinu. We have come to the country of the Amori that God has given to us. Amori is one of the 7 nations of Canaan. In the promise made to Abraham in Brit Ben Abatarim, Ki lo shalem avon Amori adhena. Sometimes the Amori becomes the kind of term that represents all the 7 nations. Usually the nation that's singled out is the nation of Canaan, Eretz Canaan, Eretz HaKanani. Sometimes it's Eretz HaEmori. We have come to the right place, says Moshe. This is the promise that God made to us. And in verse number 21, God will give us the land, Alei Reish. Let us go up and possess the land as God has spoken. Al tira v'al techat. Do not be afraid. Okay. Now, we're about to encounter the story of the so-called Meraglim, the scouts or the spies. This is how the book begins. It starts with the appointing of judges, and then we move to the episode of the Meraglim. The Meraglim is one of the central stories in the first part of the book. And Moshe instructs them, says, go up and possess it. Al tira v'al techat, do not be afraid. Okay, that was Moshe's command. And now we have a description of the Meraglim story, which of course, and I mentioned this already, will be very, very different from the description of the Meraglim story that we have in the book of Bamidbar. Very different. We'll note this as we read it. V'tikrevu nelai kulchem. You all came forward. V'tomru, you said, Nishlocha anashim lefanenu, v'yachbru lanu et haaretz, v'yashivu otam davar, et haderech asher na'aleh ba, v'yei te'orim asher navo alehen. You came to me and said, let us send men ahead of us, to reconnoiter the land. V'yachbru lanu et haaretz, I'll come back to that term. Rachbar means to dig up, right? To tell us about the path we should go up on and the cities that we will encounter. Vayitav b'yeinai hadavar. The matter was good in my eyes, says Moshe. V'akach mikem shnei masar anoshim ish echad lashavet. And I chose a person from each tribe, one person from the tribe. And let's stop here for a moment and let's recall this episode of the so-called spies as we encounter them in the book of Bamidbar, chapter 13. What is the difference between what it says here and what it says earlier in the book of Bamidbar? The first difference, which is a very glaring difference, is what?
In Bamidbar, it was Hashem's idea.
Yes. God said to Moshe, Shlach lecha anoshim v'yatu et Eretz Canaan. In Bamidbar, it's God's idea. Send people that v'yaturu et Eretz Canaan. I'll come to that word v'yaturu. Let's say to scout out the land, right? It's God's command. Over here, there's no command from God whatsoever. In fact, It's the people's idea, and all the people, not just a few people. That's one difference. Okay. What other difference do we see between what it says in Sefer Bamidbar and what it says over here in Sefer Devarim?
And Moshe thought it was a good idea.
Right. Moshe agrees.
Here it says, right here Moshe agrees. Of course, in Bamidbar, it's not Moshe's role to agree or not agree. God says, do it. You have no choice. So over here it says the people had the idea. It was good. It's good. Moshe's, it's good. But what is the idea actually? It's very interesting. The language is different. Because in the book of Bamidbar, the command is Shlachacha anu Hashem v'yaturu et eretz Canaan. The verb that's used in the book of Bamidbar is latur et haaretz. That's the verb that's used, latur et haaretz, but to scout out. But over here, it's v'yachbru lanu et haaretz. In other words, lachpar, to dig up. They have an expression in English to dig up dirt. In fact, the other verb that appears over here in verse number 24, vayiraglu ota, liragel, is to spy. We think of this story as the story of the Meraglim, the episode of the spies. But when you read the book of Bamidbar, it never says the word spies. It never says liragel, and it never says lachpar. It says lotur et haaretz. And that seems to be very different. Lotur et haaretz doesn't necessarily mean to spy. Lotur means to get a sense of what's there, not necessarily to spy. Miraglim are spies. Joseph accused his brothers of miraglim atem. You've come to see the weak points of the land, ervat haaretz. So it sounds, when you read it, that there are two very different things. This is to spy the land, spy out the weak points prior to attacking. But in the book of Bamidbar, it doesn't sound like it's to spy. It sounds as to see, and Moshe says, now what Moshe's instructions to them can be read as spying in addition, but see how the people live. And he specifically gives a commandment to bring back the fruit of the land, which is not necessarily what spies would do. In other words, when you read the book of Bamidbar, to cut to the chase over here, when you read the book of Bamidbar, what it sounds like to me, if you look at the context of Bamidbar, because the stories, the spies are chapters, I call them spies, it's chapter 13. Chapter 12 is the story of Miriam and Aaron speaking against Moshe. Chapter 11 are the complaints of the people. They don't like the food. They don't like things in general, mitonanim, etc., etc. Moshe concerned about his leadership, and I can't do it myself. The context is things are moving in the wrong direction. And what it sounds like is God says to Moshe, we need to get the people back on track over here. Send scouts into the land. They'll come back with a report about what a beautiful land it is and bring back the fruit. And this will encourage them to move forward and to possess the land. That's what it sounds like in the book of Bamidbar. It's God's idea, kind of public relations stunt. And by the way, here we come to another difference between the story over here and the story in Bamidbar, and that is, who are these people that are being sent? Over here in the verse that we just read, Moshe says, good idea. I took 12 people, ish echad lashavet, one person from each tribe. It doesn't mention who they are. It doesn't say anything about them. I chose one person per tribe. But when you read the Shlachacha Anoshim, there it talks about who are the people that are chosen. These are leaders of the tribe.
Kol nasibahem.
Kol nasibahem. These are the leaders of the tribes, which makes sense if it's going to be a kind of public relations stunt. You want to bring people that are going to come back, they're going to talk to the people, they're going to convince them that it's a good land. Let's go forward. Let's change the thinking. People are concerned, people are afraid, whatever. Let's get 12 leaders, and they'll come back, and the opportunity will be to say what a wonderful land it is. It doesn't work out that way, but that was the idea. Over here,
Rabbi Silber, also, if I
Yes.
read it up, also there's a military cast to this later recollection
Right.
The earlier is just a curiosity cast.
Right. Now,
Yeah.
right. I agree with you. And that's what I've been suggesting myself. Now, when you read the book of Bamidbar, it's not 100% certain that there's no military side to it either. But certainly it's primarily, I put a public relations idea. It's not primarily military. And by the way, if you're going to send spies, presumably, you wouldn't send people that are well known as spies. You wouldn't necessarily send the heads of the tribes as spies. On the contrary, you want to send anonymous people, which is what you have over here.
And you
This is
wouldn't
a
send
military.
12.
This is the spies, one from each tribe. Okay, but no one knows who they are. In Bamidbar, these are important people, and I suggest because they can convince the others to move forward. There's a lot of concern in Bamidbar. Now, there's another difference between the stories as well, which is this. To read a little bit further, okay, they go into the land, they bring back the fruit, right? And they said it's a good land, right? The land which God has given us is good. And now in verse number 26, below avitem lalot, you refuse to go up. Vatamru et pi Hashem Elohechem, and you rebelled against, you flouted the word of God. Vaterognu biolechem. Vaterognu is a hard word to know. They translate you sulked. It's not clear that means sulking. It's only a negative word. B'sinat Hashem otanu hotzionu mi'eretz Mitzrayim, v'teit otanu b'yad ha'emori lashbidenu. No, God intends to harm us. God took us out of Egypt to harm us. Onu anachnu olim. Achenu heimasu et levavenu leimar. Am gadol v'ram mimenu. Orim gedolot uvetzurot b'shamayim. Now, here's an interesting point about Sefer Devarim. When you're reading Sefer Devarim, so I've made the point that when you read the story over here, it is a completely different story. And by the way, I'll mention just another detail which is not here in the story at all, but is found in the book of Bamidbar. In the book of Bamidbar, the spies that Moshe sent into the land, the scouts, the spies, the head of the tribes, the Torah says they all died. God put them all to death. God kills all those so-called spies. There's no mention here whatsoever that the people sent in are punished in any way. It never suggests that at all. It mentions nothing about the 12 people that Moshe sends in. It only talks about the people. So it's a totally different story, but I want to emphasize this. It would appear that the book of Devarim assumes that you know the other story. Because the point over here is that these 12 people who come back, right? What did they say in verse number 25? Tovaha aretz asher Hashem Elokeinu notenu anu. They came back with one verse. It's a good land. In the book of Devarim, in the book of Bamidbar, that's not the story. In the book of Bamidbar, they say it's a good land, but it's a good land. But the people there are giants. We can't possibly defeat them, etc., etc. All that is missing in Sefer Devarim. All they say in Sefer Devarim is, their reported speech is, Tovah haaretz asher Hashem Elokeinu noten lanu. But when the people refuse to go up, the people say in verse number 28, how can we go up? Our brothers, the scouts who went in, or the spies, they've weakened our resolve. They've melted our hearts, saying there's a great nation there, and there are large cities with walls up to the heavens. We saw giants over there. That's not reported here in Sefer Devarim. It says nothing of the sort in Sefer Devarim. The reader is left to imagine what the people are hearing. But the text never says they actually said that. Now, they do say that in Sefer Bamidbar. So I put out there as a question, is the reader, presumed reader, the imagined reader of the story, does the reader know Bamidbar? Is that what we're assuming here? The reader knows the book of Bamidbar and takes it into account, or not? Or it's simply the Torah's way of saying over here that this is what the people are hearing. We don't know what they actually said. The only thing we know, they said it's a good land. And now the Torah reports what the people heard them say. Maybe they spoke for 5 hours about the land. But what the people are saying is our resolve has been weakened by the report. But the report, as we read it, says nothing of the sort. That actually is a very interesting question about who is the reader of the story, who's the imagined reader of the story, the implied reader. Who is the implied reader? It's always a good question. What does the reader know? What does the Torah assume the reader knows? That's a very, very interesting question. It's not for now, but it's a very important question. In any event, that's what the people are saying. The people say we can't do it. And Moshe now says to them, V'omar alechem lo tartsun v'lo tirun mipneihem. I said to you, do not be afraid. Have no dread or fear of them. Now, what Moshe said earlier, right, back in verse 21, right before this episode where they want these scouts to go in verse 21, Moshe says, listen, God has said, God is going to give you the land. Alei reish, go and possess the land. Al tira v'al techat, do not be afraid. So in verse 21, it's al tira v'al techat. In verse number 29, lo taritsun v'lo tirun mehem. Now, why do I mention this over here? Because what strikes me is that these two verses, do not be afraid, already echoes something else in the chapter. Because the first thing this chapter begins with is not the spy episode. The first thing the chapter begins with is the appointing of judges. And Moshe says to the people, and at that time, I spoke to the judges. This is not present in the Torah earlier. Moshe appoints the judges. It doesn't say with Yitro that he spoke to the judges, but in Sefer Devarim, he speaks to the judges. And what does he say to the judges? Judge fairly. Don't favor one of the other. But he begins with, let's see. In verse number 17. Lo takiru ponim b'mishpat, do not favor one side. Kakaton kagodol dishmaun. Lo taguru mipnei ish, do not fear. The judges are commanded to have no fear. Lo taguru mipnei ish. And what's striking is the chapter begins with the Moshe speaking to the judges, among other things, have no fear. But that instruction, have no fear, is what Moshe twice says in the very next story. He says to the people, possess the land, al tira v'al techat. And he says to the people again in verse number 29, lo tarsun v'lo tirun mehem. Not only that, we continue reading in chapter 1, in verse number 30, Hashem Elohechem ha'olech lifnechem hu yilochem lochem, k'chol asher asa itchem b'Mitzrayim li'enechem. Have no fear, because God will fight for you. The same God who performed the miracles in Egypt before your eyes. Uvamidbar asher ra'ita, asher nisacha Hashem Elokecha kasher yisaish et beno. And in the desert, God carried you as one carries a child. V'chol haderech asher halachtem ad boachem ad hamakom hazel. V'adavar hazeh einchem ma'aminim b'Hashem Elohechem. Ha'olech lifnechem baderech v'tur lechem makom lechanotchem bo'eish layla rarotchem baderech asher telchu ba uve'anon yomam. So basically, Moshe says to the people, listen, Moshe steps in over here in verse 29. Have no fear. The same God who has been with you in Egypt, the same God who has carried you through the desert, that same God is going to bring you to this place that God has instructed you to go. And your refusal to accept this is a lack of faith. And concerning this matter, ubadavar hazeh einchem ma'aminim b'Hashem Elohechem. The God who walks before you in verse 33, ha'olech lifnechem baderech v'tur lechem makom lechanotchem bo'eish layla rarotchem baderech asher telchu ba uve'anon yomam. So that's what Moshe says. So I was thinking, if you think about this, what did Moshe say to the judges? The first thing is, you need a system of judges. You're going to possess a land, it's got to be a just society. So you have to appoint judges. Moshe can't do it himself. In fact, Moshe won't even be entering the land. So you got to appoint judges. And basically what Moshe says to the judges is, I told the judges, judge fairly. And if you don't understand, if you don't know the answer, right? If you don't know the answer, says Moshe, then you come to me, right? Then you come to me. Well, where does it say that? In verse number 17, right? Lo takiru panim b'mishpat kakaton kagadol tishma'un, right? Then, lo taguru b'pnei, have no fear. Justice, judgment belongs to God. V'yad davar asher yikshem mikem takrivun elai ushmativ. And if you don't have the answer, if you don't know what to do, come to me. I will tell you what to do. That's how the book begins. What's the next story? This episode of the spies. So there are a bunch of people that are sent into the land. They come back with a report. The report we have is it's a good land. Tova Aretz. The Torah does not speak about any division. The Torah doesn't say that 2 said one way and 10 said the other way. But what they're hearing, their interpretation of it is we can't do it. The people are too powerful for us. We can't do it. The city's up to the heavens, etc. So then Moshe says, I told you not to be afraid, right? Now let me tell you what to do. In other words, Moshe steps in over here at this impasse. There's an impasse. And then Moshe steps in. That's exactly what Moshe said to the judges earlier. You're going to judge. If you don't know what to do, you're stuck. You don't know what to do. Then you turn to me, and I will tell you what to do. The point I'm making over here, then I'll stop and take comments and questions. The point I'm making over here is that the book begins with judges, okay? But the point of the story is that there are people we call judges of the thousands and the hundreds and the tens and the 50s. But from a certain perspective, everybody's making judgments. The people are making judgments. People are deciding what to do. The people have decided based on what they're hearing, they're not going into the land. And then Moshe steps in. Moshe says, I told you, if you don't know what to do, right? They said it's good. You're thinking maybe not. You're hearing something else. Well, I told you, if you're confused and confounded and don't know what to do, then you come to me, and I will tell you what to do. I would say that's especially true if we assume that the reader of Sefer Devarim, I'm not saying we have to assume this, but if you assume the reader of Sefer Devarim is aware of the story in Bamidbar, and the story of Bamidbar, the 12 people that were sent into the land, 10 said one way and 2 said the other way. It wasn't unanimous. There was a dispute. If you assume there's a dispute over here, there's a lack of clarity, there's a lack of knowledge. What did Moshe say in the very beginning? In making your judgments, if you're not sure, then you come to me, and I will direct you on the right path. And that's exactly what happens over here. In other words, the idea that judges aren't just people officially judges, but that everybody in life has to make decisions. Everybody makes judgments, okay? Sometimes we don't know what the right answer is. Then you go to someone that we believe will know what the right thing is. So what we have over here then is what I would say a failure of judgment. Not judgment on the part of the judges, but judgment on the part of the people. And it's actually, I just want to say one other thing before I stop for a moment, which is when you read, for example, back in the book of Shemot, these are the laws you shall place before them. When you read that verse in chapter 21 of Exodus, which introduces all these laws, it's not clear who is the lahem. These are the laws you place before them. Is it talking about the judges? Or is it talking about the people? It sounds like this is what you should tell the people. At the end of the day, the people are responsible. We can't always blame our leaders for our problems. We also have to take some responsibility ourselves. But in any event, what I find very striking over here is the connection between the first 2 pieces of Sefer Devarim. That is the appointing of judges on one hand, and then the I would say, mistaken judgment of the people who decide based on what they're hearing, despite what Moshe says, that they can't possess the land. Now, let me stop here for a moment, and then we will continue.
It
Anybody have any
reminds
comments
me,
or questions?
it reminds me a little bit of when Yitro was giving advice to him, a kind
Yes.
of delegating advice. That's what it sounds like a little bit.
You mean
In the
that?
early, when Yitro sat with him and told him to delegate, now he's kind of doing that in a way.
Right. The point is he certainly has delegated. He appoints these 12 people, but then he always steps in at the end because he says, this is what God would want. This is based on my understanding, or based on your understanding of what has transpired till now. You are forgetting the God who took you out of Egypt. You're forgetting the God who carried you through the desert. And by the way, I just want to add one thing over here, which is that one of the basic themes of Sefer Devarim Devarim has several very basic themes. But one of the themes that we encounter in Sefer Devarim is this commandment to, in fact, remember. For example, I'll give you an example. We'll come to this later on. The experience of standing at Sinai. The book of Devarim makes the receiving of the Torah at Sinai probably the central event. It's funny, when you read the Chumash earlier, obviously standing at Sinai is extremely important. But I'm not sure that we would say it's the most significant event necessarily. When you read Sefer Devarim, it is clear that the receiving of the Torah is the central event. And Sefer Devarim actually says we have to remember that event. We have to remember what we experienced at Sinai and pass it on to the next generation. In fact, the Ramban, in his critique of the Rambam wrote up the 613 commandments, the Sefer HaMitzvot. The Ramban critiques it, and among the critiques is, he says, the Rambam has mitzvot, he lists mitzvot that shouldn't be there, but he also forgot to list certain mitzvot. And one of the mitzvot the Ramban says he forgot to list is the mitzvah to remember the experience of Sinai. You have to remember we stood at Sinai. The book of Devarim, and that's found later on in chapter, I believe it's chapter 4, chapter 9, we'll get to it, chapter 4, chapter 9, says explicitly not to forget. Let me see if I can find this very quickly. Yes, chapter 4, verse number 9. Rakishama lecha ushmar nafshecha ma'od, pentishkach et hadvarim asher ra einecha. Take utmost care. Do not forget the things that you saw with your own eyes. Right? What are the things you saw with your own eyes? Yom asher amadeta lefnei Hashem Elokecha b'chorev. When you stood before God in Chorev is Sinai. B'mor Hashem Elai hakilu et ha'am v'yashmiim. When I said, when God's commanded me, gather the people, and I will teach the people, in order that they learn to fear me all of the days, etc. And you stood unto the mountain, and the mountain was burning with fire, right? And God spoke to you from amidst the fire. That's Matan Torah. That's the reception of the Torah. The Ramban says, the Rambam left out this mitzvah. There's a mitzvah to remember standing at Sinai, to remember the event of Sinai, to remember the shofar and the sound of Sinai, etc. The revelation of Sinai, the experience of Sinai. The Ramban says that's a mitzvah. So the idea of remembering is very, very central to this book. And that's what Moshe is saying over here. You're making a decision, but you're not taking into account the past. You're not thinking about the God who has been with you all this time, the God who took you out of Egypt, the God who bore you through the desert. It's the same God who says possess the land. So it's a kind of forgetting. It's not looking at the larger context. And that's basically a Sefer Devarim theme throughout the book. We will encounter a set of basic themes in Sefer Devarim. And that's Moshe steps in, but apparently the people pay no attention to what Moshe is saying. And that's what you have now in the next verse. Vayishma Hashem et kol divrechem, vayiksof vayishav. God heard your complaint, and God got angry. God was very angry, and God yishavah, God swore. God took an oath. And the oath is, if את הארץ הטובה שנשבעתי לתת לאבותיכם. זולתי כלב בן יפונה הוא ירנה. ולא אתן את הארץ אשר דרך בה ולבניו, yan Hashem milei acharei Hashem. So God took an oath. It's interesting that God takes an oath over here. Why is God taking an oath? Because God had taken an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to give their descendants the land. But what you have over here is a kind of counter oath. When God heard your voice, God heard what you were saying. God was upset about the lack of gratitude for the God who, or the lack of awareness of God who has been with them. And God took an oath that this generation will not possess this land. This bad generation, Dor Harazeh, will not possess the good land. It's a bad generation and a good land. Those don't work together. And finally, in verse 36, except for Kalev ben Yefuna. Kalev ben Yefuna was one who remained loyal to God. Now, over here in this chapter, it never mentions Kalev ben Yefuna. It doesn't mention him by name at all. In fact, it doesn't mention any of the spies.
It doesn't mention Yoshua.
Doesn't mention Yoshua. That's a separate question, a good question. We'll leave that out for now. We'll deal with that in the future. But my point is, it only makes sense, presumably, if the reader knows the earlier story. In the earlier story, Kalev and Yoshua are singled out, especially Kalev. So it sounds to me like the reader is aware of the story. The reader is aware of Sefer Bamidbar. That's not to say that we have to reconcile this story here with Bamidbar. My point is that, in a way, it's the opposite. In a way, what Sefer Devarim seems to be saying is, or Moshe is saying is, you're aware of a certain account that the Torah has earlier. You're aware of that. Now I want to tell you my account, and my account doesn't necessarily conform to the earlier account. I mean, there's no way, in my view, to reconcile everything in Sefer Devarim with what it says earlier. There's just too many contradictions. So therefore, I don't think that the Torah is concerned about it. But my point is, but this verse number 36, certainly suggests to us that the reader knows about the earlier story. Otherwise, Kalev coming out of thin air. Who mentioned Kalev over here? The reader must be aware of the fact. The Torah assumes the reader's aware, maybe from Bamidbar, maybe from some other tradition, but aware of the fact that Kalev ben Yefuna was one person singularly who was loyal to God, etc. And there's a promise to Kalev. Now,
Rabbi, excuse
yes.
me. Sorry, it's Sandra. I have a question, if you don't mind, about the stress on do not be afraid.
Yes.
So you've taught us over the years that if God says in the Torah, do not be afraid, as you said, be very afraid. In other words, so here we have, verse 21, 29, verse 17, verse 30, we've got do not be afraid, do not be afraid, do not be afraid. Moses is saying it, but he says it in two themes. He says it about the judges, not to be afraid of judging, and the big and the little, and treat everyone right. And then he says, don't be afraid about going into the land. So are we supposed to see a theme here, which is that whether you're a judge, or whether you're a Nasi, or whether you're just the regular guy in generation 2, from Mitzrayim, what Moses is afraid of is the fear that high and low people are going to bring to the deal. The judges are going to be afraid of judging with tzedek, or they might be, or they could potentially be, and the people are afraid to go into the land, or afraid they won't succeed, afraid. I mean, so this fear is like, oh my gosh, like a boulder on the shoulders of everybody, whether they got Dol and Katan. So this just came through to me really as a blast as you're teaching the first hour of our talk today, and I'm just asking you, is this so? Is it like you said, when they say do not be afraid, be afraid? And in fact, is it so pervasive that Moses is just really, really trying to stave it off? Is this so? And how do we walk?
I would say this. I would say that I agree with you that in other words, when God, like an analog, it's not precise. When God said to Yaakov's running away from home,
right? And
God says to Yaakov,
"Al tira Yaakov,
I'm going to be with you. I'm going to protect you." Right? then you realize for the first time, he's not going off for a 2-week vacation. I mean, when God says, I'm going to protect you, that means you're going to need protection.
Yeah.
I'm not going to abandon you means you're in trouble. And when Moshe says, don't be afraid, there is reason to be afraid. The people in the land there are giants in the land. There's no question about that. In fact, what I'll get back to Yeshua maybe next week, but Yeshua appears 2 verses later. It is very interesting in the story in Bamidbar, in the spy episode in Bamidbar, that when the people say, they begin to suggest that we can't do it, that Caleb speaks up. Yeshua is silent, and Caleb says, "No, we can defeat them." And Yeshua says nothing, doesn't open his mouth up. Later, the people say, "Forget it, let's go back to Egypt." Then Yeshua says, "If God is with us, then we can win." And the point I made when we studied the Bamidbar is that what the people are saying from an objective standpoint is true. The people in the land are stronger than we are. That is true. And therefore, when Yeshua is the general, and he knows they're stronger, so when Caleb says we can beat them, Yeshua says nothing. But when the people say let's go back to Egypt, then Yeshua speaks up. If God is with us, we can win. He understands. Without God's help, we can't win because they're stronger than we are. But with God's help, we can always win with God's help. And that's Yeshua is the general. So when Caleb is saying, well, we can defeat them, Yeshua says nothing because he can't defeat them in and of themselves. Yes. Jerome, you want to say something?
Yeah, yes. On the Sinai question, Sinai as the central motif of Devarim.
Yes.
Question is that in Maseh, which is clearly a transition to Sefer Devarim from Bamidbar, Sinai, at least explicitly, is simply not mentioned.
That's true. That's right. Well, that's not a problem for us. As I said in the last week and this week, Sefer Devarim has to be read as an independent book, and I'm not making no attempt to reconcile it with the earlier stories. I don't think it can be reconciled personally. And let me say one point about why I think the Torah is very central to the book of Devarim specifically. This is a very fundamental theme of Sefer Devarim. I'll mention it now, and we'll come back to it probably on various occasions. One of the basic differences between Sefer Devarim is a book in which Moshe says to the people, you are about to possess the land, and you're going to create your own. You're going to create your own society. You're going to have judges. You're going to have prophets. You're going to have priests, etc., etc., etc. You're going to have a king. And what's interesting is when and you're going to visit God 3 times a year. When you read Sefer Devarim, it's very clear. God is up in heaven. Hashkifa mimon kadshecha min hashamayim. The God of Sefer Devarim does not walk amongst us. The God of Sefer Devarim is a distant God who from heaven looks down upon the earth. And God is involved in the earth, but from a distance. The God of the book of Vayikra, the promise in Vayikra, I will walk amongst you. The Mishkan, God dwells amongst us. And the point is, the question that Sefer Devarim is wrestling with is, how does one connect to a God who is very distant? And I think the answer that the book of Devarim is giving, a central theme of Sefer Devarim is, you connect to God by living a life which reflects God's commands and God's values. And therefore the idea of mitzvah, the idea of Torah, is absolutely an essential idea in Sefer Devarim. It's the way you connect to a distant God. And that's why in Sefer Devarim it's very central. When the earlier books of the Torah speak about a God who actually walks amongst you. God is with you in the desert. Kvod Hashem is there. The Mishkan, V'shachanti b'tocham. The God in Sefer Devarim is not dwelling amongst us. God is someplace up in distant heaven. And the way we can connect to this God is through living the just life, the Torah, the mitzvah, etc. Which is why, now we'll come back to this theme. It's a very prevalent theme in Sefer Devarim. And I think that reflects that the entire book is read differently. When you read it that way, it's about your own. It's very modern in a certain sense. You're creating your own society, your own country, you're taking responsibility, which is all good. And the question is, can you create a just society? And the Torah, Devarim, is about a blueprint towards creating a just society. And we'll see this throughout the mitzvot, which are very striking. They have a very, even when they're the same mitzvot, they have a different cast to them. They have a different focus, a different emphasis. And that's why in Sefer Devarim, the Torah is absolutely at the center. We'll come back to this. It's a very, 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 very basic point. Come back to Sandra's point about fear. There is reason to be afraid. There's certainly reason to be afraid. As I said, the people in the land are stronger than we are. They're powerful nations. And the only way you can defeat them is with God's assistance. But if God is going to drop out of the picture, you cannot defeat them. And God says at this point in these verses, I plan to drop out of the picture, right? God takes an oath, like Sofa Yishav Alimar. This generation, this is not the generation. One person, Kalev Ben Yefuna, we'll start with him next week about the role of Kalev over here. But that's where it stands at this point. Now, are there any other comments or questions at this point?
Yes, I'd like to highlight one from chat. This from Stacy Lehman saying,
Yes.
quote, judges are fearing judging wrongly. Moshe telling people not to fear is two different types of fear.
Well, the fear of the Moshe is, look, the specific fear over here that the judges have, as described, seems to be a fear actually, Stacy's point is well taken. There are two different kinds of fear. The one kind of fear is you're afraid of one of the two parties. There's the so-called important person, and there's the gadol and there's the katan. And you're afraid that if you favor the katan, you're going to suffer consequences because of that. That's one fear. That's explicit. And Stacy's point is maybe there's another fear over here, which is I would say a different order of fear, which is very valid, which is you're afraid of making mistakes. I mean, that's, there in the Talmud speaks about people that were very afraid to become judges because it's a great responsibility. You're making decisions about someone else's life, and maybe you're making a mistake. Maybe you're making the wrong decision, and that's also a fear, one might say. And maybe that's addressed by the verse number 17. Don't be afraid, ki hamishpat leElohimu, which could mean because judgment belongs to God. Which means what? Which means at the end of the day, perhaps the expectation is true justice is God. Is God. That's why Moshe didn't want anybody else to judge initially, because who are we to make judgments? Because we're all fallible people. So perhaps that's part of it. Perhaps Moshe's saying is justice belongs to God, and it's God who has ordained or made possible. True justice belongs to God. So we understand this. You've got to make mistakes. Nonetheless, you can't have a society without the attempt to do things right. And Moshe says, and I'm always around to try to assist, etc. I or someone who replaces me. He's not going to be around. He's going to be gone in a couple of months, actually. But it means someone who plays my role. We'll get to that later on. When Moshe is gone, who plays that role? There's the book of Devarim is concerned about, more than any other book, about the system of justice. And we'll get to that later on. Not sure we'll get to it in this semester, but eventually, hopefully we can complete this book. And we're touching already upon some of the basic themes of the book, and we'll have an occasion to encounter them. That's a very important point about the fear. The one fear is the repercussions of what I do. Maybe the side that I don't favor may come back to attack me, to harm me, etc. And then there's the other fear, the fear that maybe we're doing the wrong thing. Maybe the judge makes a mistake. Then that's a different kind of fear, and that comes with the territory. But we'll talk more about that. Okay, maybe we'll stop at this point then.
I have an
Yes.
observation.
Yes.
And it follows on what Chaim said.
Yes.
Looking at this Dvarim as its own book,
Yes.
what if the people never heard that there's Anakim in Canaan, and they don't know that as a fact, but they're afraid, they're assuming, and I think that is such a manifestation of trauma and fear. Wherever we're going is dangerous.
Totally possible. It
So-
is certainly possible. The reason I raised the other possibility is because the language over here in verse number 20, was 28, is actually the language of the book of Bamidbar. Arim
Uh-huh.
b'tzurot b'shamayim. You know, the fortresses up to the heavens is exactly the language of Sefer Bamidbar, which suggests to me that they actually have heard these words. Not simply making them up. This is what the spies say in the book of Bamidbar. But your point is well taken, because we don't really know. The book of Devarim doesn't say they said that. So it could be their imagination, their trauma, their fear, etc. Or it could be they're picking up on something that they said. You know, they may have spoken for 10 hours. People pick up on things that speak to them for any number of reasons, their own fears, etc. And we understand the fear. The fear, as Sandra said, is they're going to a place unknown, try to capture a land that they don't know much about. They've heard perhaps it's a you know, they've maybe heard stories about the present inhabitants of the land, etc. So we would understand that they might be frightened. And I would say that, just to say one last point about it, in other words, the generation that leaves Egypt is not going to possess the land. Is not possessing the land should be seen primarily as a kind of sin, or not possessing the land can be seen a different way. They can't make that jump yet. In other words, to leave slavery and to create your own society, a free society, maybe that takes 2 generations. Maybe it's not so much about sin. Maybe it's just about human limitation, which is an interesting question that applies to several stories of the Bible. Maybe I'll start next week. If we raise that question next week, I'll talk about that a bit. We have a long path ahead of us here. Looking forward to it. It's a great book, and it's a very important book. And I would say one last thing about Sefer Devarim. I mentioned this last week. The core pieces of Jewish liturgy all are in Sefer Devarim. The first parsha of Shema, the second parsha of Shema, the Passover Haggadah, the Seder. The main texts are all from Sefer Devarim, which itself is very, very interesting. Maybe we can reflect upon that in the future as well. Okay, I'll stop at this point then.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
You
you.
want
You can always email me with questions, dsilber@drisha.org.
All
Okay.
right. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone, for joining.
Okay.
I
Thank
just
you.
would like to highlight one upcoming class as part of our Falls Monadrisha, starting later today at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. I believe slightly different in Israel because of the recent clock change, is Mishnah in Depth Hulin. We're starting this week with Rabbi Avi Wolfish. He is an excellent teacher of Mishnah. If you are able to make it, I strongly encourage signing up at drisha.org/classes. Take care, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you for joining.